Hello and welcome to Faragadamu. She is a psychologist, a psychotherapist, but she is also a writer, a crime novelist. 5 of those thus far. Now she felt it was time for a biography. The Person I Became in Addis Ababa, just published, is about how her early childhood in Addis somehow defined her. That was 1960 to 1964. My guest, Asa Nilsonne, was a daughter of the then Swedish ambassador to Ethiopia. What is she trying to tell? A very warm welcome to the program, Asa Nilsonne.
Thank you for having me.
So your book, The Person I Became in Addis Ababa, this is your new book. It's in Swedish, right? A biography, if you will.
That's right, yes.
It's about your 4.5 years in Addis Ababa, way back in between 1960 and 1964, correct?
Yes. I was between 11.
Go ahead.
Yes, I was between 11 and 14.
11 and 14. You were the daughter of the then Swedish ambassador to Ethiopia.
Yes.
What is it that you're trying to address here in your book?
Well, I'm a psychiatrist by profession, and I meet so many people who tell a story that goes something like this. This was my life, and then something happened, and that changed everything. My parents got divorced, or a small sister died, or something happened. And they have this idea that what happens to us can just change the course of our life very drastically. And very often they attribute this change of direction to one thing that happened. And I've always thought that this is quite a superficial analysis, because there are so many things going on at the same time. And I thought it would be interesting to pick out a piece of my life and look at all the very, very many things that happened, for instance, during those years in Ethiopia, and to try to think, what could this possibly have meant? What could this possibly have done to change the course of my life, if anything? And that was very exciting to think about and very exciting to write about.
A piece of your life, but a defining piece of your life at the same time, correct?
Actually, I think for many people, those years, when you're 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, when you begin to orient yourself away from your family and towards society as a whole, towards your surroundings, I think for many of us, those years are very full of important things that happen, because at that time, I think one is quite open to experience, one is quite open to understanding and misunderstanding a context. And actually, I've had reactions about my book from people who have just lived in the same place always. And they say that they recognize themselves, which I think is interesting, because I was expecting to get a lot of recognition from people who had led similar lives, who had parents who'd been moving around, because we all share something. But I was very sort of gratified as a writer to find that even people who had completely different backgrounds saw themselves in the book.
I mean, 1960 to 1964, it was a time of decolonization in Africa. African countries were getting independent one after the other, actually in quick succession.
Yes.
So that was part of your life as well, right? In the way you understood Ethiopia and the way you understood Africa.
Yes. It was a time of somehow amazing optimism. My father, being a diplomat, had a sort of broad political view of things, and he was so excited about this. And I know that his Ethiopian colleagues were also sort of excited. And the idea was somehow that Ethiopia, being the non-colonized country, would be the automatic and obvious leader for all the other countries. And they built Africa whole, and there was a great sense of being, right where everything was happening from a decolonization point of view. And I think my father and most of his colleagues were so convinced that something really great was coming out of this for Africa, that Africa would finally own its own resources, minerals and oil and whatever, and be able to reappropriate their cultural heritage. And so there was this sort of, because Ethiopia at that time was very poor. There were a lot of poor people, and there was a lot of, sort of poverty. And on the other side of this balance was this idea that this is not going to be like this forever. This is going to change. So it was a very hopeful set of years.
So you went to school at where? At the Lycée Gabriel Mariam? That's the French school.
Yes, exactly. The French one, which was very close to where we lived.
To where you live, yeah. And you had so many Ethiopian friends, I guess.
Well, actually, not all that many, because the class was very mixed. There were people from almost everywhere. There were no Americans because they had their own school. There were no Chinese. There were no Japanese. There were Indian people, although they mostly went to the British school. But mostly the Ethiopian kids, kept a little bit to themselves. So it was actually harder to make friends with them than it was to make friends with other people who were expats.
But you had Ethiopians in the household, right?
The house was
you had Ethiopians at home.
Lots and lots and lots of them. It was actually like moving into almost a small village. There were people everywhere, and I liked that so much.
Meaning?
Well, meaning that there was a very cheerful atmosphere in the house. I think partially because we had this cook called Marga, whose name was very appropriate because he was very sort of distinguished and very calm and very friendly. And so wherever he went, there was this sort of aura of good feeling, of relaxation, of almost happiness. And in the whole kitchen was just sort of filled with his personality, which made it a very attractive place to be. So my brother and I would sneak into the kitchen, and my mother would come in and say, "You must not disturb Marga, he's working." And when my mother left, Marga would say, "You do not disturb me." And then he would go on, sort of showing what he was doing. And there was like Waynishet, who was a young woman who would help my brother and me against our grandmother, because we had a very strict grandmother. And Waynishet thought that the grandmother was too strict, which she showed by, for instance, when my grandmother was checking to see if our hands were clean when we'd wash them, Waynishet would stand behind her and she would go, like saying, "Your grandmother is crazy." And that was also actually very supportive for me and my brother, because we thought she was too strict as well. And it was nice to have somebody, a grown-up, saying, "Yes, this grandmother's your grandmother's overdoing it."
So why did you write this biography, and why now?
Well, why now is a really good question, because I started when I was 20, because then I was angry. I was angry about the way I had been brought up. I was angry about having been moved around and being forced to learn new languages the whole time, being forced to leave my friends. And I thought the foreign department was some sort of horrible monster that wrecked the lives of children. And that didn't work out. You can't really write a book just because you're angry. Well, you can, but it won't be a very good book. And then when I got a little bit older, when I was around 30, my friends would say, "What? You grew up in Ethiopia? Where is Ethiopia?" "Oh yes, in Africa." Now that must have been very interesting. And then I began to think that, yes, well, maybe this actually was something that was of interest to people. So I thought maybe I should write about it. And then I got married and I had 3 children and I did my PhD and I just didn't have the time. And then when I was 40, for the first time, I really began to miss Ethiopia because I'd been too sort of busy trying to adjust to Sweden. So then I tried to write this very sentimental book, about the beauty of Ethiopia and the soil and the smells. And it was terrible. It was pathetic. And I got very bored with it. And it went on like this, and I kept trying to find different ways of writing about it. And finally, at the age of almost 75, I discovered how to do it. And then I did it, and I'm so happy.
Discovered how to do it, meaning
Well, meaning that
you can look into the diverse facets of Ethiopia. What do you mean?
well, I think as you grow older, you sort of become a little bit more, not exactly detached, but you can see your earlier life from a broader perspective. And I began to understand that what I needed to do was actually to try to pick out a few questions, and the main question being what actually happened. Because I was somebody when I arrived in Ethiopia, and I was somebody else when I left Ethiopia, and to try to think about what could have happened during those years to influence that sort of development. And then I thought that a biography shouldn't be like a travel book, On Tuesday I did this, on Wednesday I did this, on Thursday I did this, because it becomes very boring. So I thought I would just try to find some key episodes and then just describe them as completely as I could and trying to relate them backwards and forwards. And it turned out to be a good concept. So it's actually, I'm not trying to tell everything. I've just tried to pick out some things that I thought were relevant.
Did the fact that you ended up being a psychologist and psychotherapist in a way help you understand Ethiopia from this vantage point of?
Yes, I think so, because as a psychiatrist or as a psychotherapist, you're continuously dealing with trying to understand people's image of their past. And we all know that memories are famously unreliable. And so you're sort of used to working with the unreliability of memories. And I think any psychiatrist or psychotherapist has to be interested in the question, how did you come to be the person you are? Why are you interested in this? How come you keep doing this all the time? Why can't you stop doing that? And it's quite common for people who are psychiatrists and psychotherapists to have this kind of background. Like anthropologists, apparently almost every anthropologist has grown up in various cultures. And you become aware of the fact that cultures are actually different. Societal expectations are actually very different. What is considered completely normal in one place is completely crazy somewhere else.
I know. I mean, your mother used to write diaries every single day, and your father was an avid collector of newspapers while they were in Ethiopia. Did
Yes.
parents somehow did their collection somehow help you write your memoir? Or how
Tremendously.
important was that in the writing of your?
Very important. I actually found my mother's little diary when she died. She was 96 years old. I didn't even know it existed. And it was just the shortest, it was one of these little diaries that the airlines give you as a gift. And it had 2 days on every small page. And she wrote things like, for instance, enrolled Asa in French school. And the next day she wrote, Asa started school. And the next day she wrote, school is a catastrophe. And then after that, she didn't mention it again. And this sort of mixed with appointments for the hairdresser and all kinds of things. So it wasn't very personal, but it was just a description of, a little bit of what her days were like. And my father, of course, had these newspaper clippings, which were very useful for me because obviously I would have not known a lot of the details, for instance, about the coup 1960. But that was quite well documented in the newspaper clippings my father had collected. So I was able to write about the Ethiopian minister in Stockholm, Tefari Sharo, who didn't wait. My father said, when something dramatic happens, the best thing to do is nothing. Just wait and just see what happens. But Tefari Sharo in Stockholm didn't wait. As soon as the coup was announced, he invited a lot of journalists to his apartment in Stockholm. gave him champagne and said, "This is fantastic. The terrible tyrant has been deposed. The emperor is gone. Long live the new crown prince, Asa Nilsonne." And then, unfortunately for him, the emperor came back. The coup was averted. And this poor guy in Stockholm had, of course, committed political suicide. And all of that I wouldn't have remembered very much in detail, but my father had it all, in portraits and interviews with him, interviews with his daughters. So I was able to draw on that.
But all of your books are in Swedish, right? I mean, this book is also about Swedish. Are you planning to have it translated into Amharic anytime soon?
Well, the thing is, it's a little bit like a woman wanting to get married a long time ago. You don't propose to a man if you're a woman. You expect somebody to come and propose to you. And it's a bit the same thing with books being translated. I can't take my book and go to a publisher and say, "Would you like to translate this?" The publisher has to come to me and say, "We have read your book and we are interested in translating it into French or whatever." But I keep hoping that one or several of my books will be translated, especially since I have 2 crime novels that are set in Ethiopia. And I've always dreamt of having those translated into Amharic. And I've actually tried to find somebody here. But it turns out that translating is, it's a profession. And it's not actually enough to speak both Amharic and Swedish to be able to do a good translation. And I haven't been able to find anybody yet who could translate in a way that sort of turned the book into a reasonable copy of what it was in Swedish.
All right. So you, of course, you just say that you mentioned 2 of your books, which are basically set in Ethiopia. These are crime novels. You have also plenty more, a few more, at least 5, correct?
Yes. But let me say something else about those 2, because I was listening to an interview with a Nigerian writer the other day, and she said she is working in the United States. And she said that she'd written this novel set in Nigeria, and this American professor of literature had told her that the book was not authentic. And she was very surprised, being Nigerian, writing about Nigeria. And it turned out that he was unhappy about the fact that she was writing about middle-class people. He thought a book from Africa could feature starving children, and if it didn't, it wasn't authentic. And this is what happened to me with my crime novels, because I wrote about a journalist, I wrote about doctors. I actually wrote about something which was happening at that time, and for all I know, it could be happening now as well, which was that radiologists in Canada and the United States were sending their x-rays to Ethiopia. Ethiopian radiologists were doing the assessments, sending the assessments back. They would be signed by the Americans or the Canadians. And the Americans and the Canadians would be getting a lot of money for those assessments, and they would be paying a small fraction of that money to the Ethiopians. And this was the sort of plot in my book. And this happens. And I got exactly the same reaction from the Swedish journalists. This can't be Ethiopia. People are driving cars, people have TVs, people have the same kinds of problems as people do in any country. What school should I send my children to? I need to buy a new pair of shoes, this sort of thing. They were not thinking about how do I get my next meal. And so I was hoping that these books would educate people a bit and show them that, well, they didn't, because people didn't believe what I wrote. It was very annoying. It was like this Nigerian writer who found herself not being believed simply because she was showing a picture of Africa that people did not recognize. So it's been frustrating. But I hope to do the same with the present book, because it has quite a lot of Ethiopian history and some geography. Actually, my editor, when I sent the manuscript, he said, "You can't have 10 pages of Ethiopian history." And I said, "Of course I can have 10 pages of Ethiopian history. Why not?" And he said, "Condense it to 2." So I had to condense. I did. I think you should always listen to your editor.
Right.
But there are 2 pages of Ethiopian history in my book, and there is a map, which I also had to fight for.
Yeah.
I have a map of Africa showing what it looked like when I was born, with all the colonized countries in black and Ethiopia and Liberia in white, just to show what it looked like. And the editor said, you can't have a map in this kind of book. And I said, I want that map, and I got to keep it. And I've had a lot of positive feedback about that, because people come and say, wow, that map was really interesting. Wow. I didn't know, I hadn't realized. Yeah.
It was really, again, a pleasure having you on my show. Asa.
Thank you. I'm just absolutely delighted to have been invited.
Anapane isim so adasa. Yamena dumekudu a